If you would take your Bibles and turn with me to Matthew chapter 2. We'll wrap up the last bit of the Christmas story that we need to touch on as we get going. We're going to talk about finding joy. Some of you may remember that as 2019 fired up, the big cultural splash of the moment was a Netflix TV series on the art of decluttering. And one of the things that they said in that show was that you should pick up, one of the things is you cleaned out a room in your house, you should pick it up and decide for yourself, does this spark joy in my life? And if not, you were supposed to get rid of it. And that lasted for about 3 weeks, and then it started getting kind of mercilessly picked on, because when I picked up the electric bill, it did not spark joy in my life. IRS Form 1040 did not spark joy in my life. Our Razorback football schedule did not spark joy in my life. Angela's cat did not. And once we hit that point, I was told that I couldn't keep throwing out the things that didn't spark joy. So that's how the year started, and then we finally, as we feel almost like 2019 is almost stumbling to a close. On the one hand, you've got strange political goings-on in terms of that on a strict party line vote, it's been, which is almost every, this makes 2 out of 3 times in history that we've impeached a president on a strict party line vote. One party voted yes, one party voted no. And yet, now they're trying to argue about whether or not to even do anything else with it, which is just bizarre, and again, puts everybody back into a holding pattern, and we're stumbling towards the end. On the one hand, the economy feels like it's doing good things, and then you run into people, well, we just lost our job because this got shut down and this got changed. And, all of these things around us and in our lives, there's the good, there's the bad, and it just doesn't feel great. And one of the things that I think we need to address is that question of finding joy. I think that's one of our challenges as a church, one of the things that we want to get back a hold of as we lean towards 2020, as we lean towards the next year, is what does it look like to walk with joy? We talk about that our church mission statement, I love that Walter brought it back up, is that we're going to walk with Jesus and take as many people with us as we can. And that is a great thing, because that is our mission, and it's as simple as you can make it. But as we walk, we ought to be striving to walk with joy. And so how do we find that? And so I thought we would take a look at Matthew chapter 2, and we talk a little bit about the wise men as we do it. But before we get there, let's pick up the context and where this fits overall in the big picture of God's glory and what's happening before we come to Matthew chapter 2. One of the things to take note of is that the Magi, they come, and we'll read them specifically in a moment, but they come from a foreign country. They come probably from the Parthian Empire, which is what took over and built on the remnants of the old Persian Empire, which built on the remnants of the Babylonian Empire, which built, you see how that goes. But they're outside the Roman Empire. One of the things that Matthew is making note of here as he works through his gospel is that in chapter 1, he's addressed the idea that Jesus has been born King of the Jews. But in Matthew chapter 2, he opens with a story that tells us that Jesus is not just for the Jewish people, but that he's for all folks. Because the Parthians, these are the people outside the Roman Empire, and Rome is always annoyed with the Parthians. Because they were never able to capture them. They were never able to conquer and push the empire that far into what was Persia, what we now call Iran. And that's where we're pretty sure the Magi come from, because that word, Magi, doesn't show up too much in Greek language at the time, except to refer to the scholars, astronomers, a little bit of astrologers, we'll deal with that in a second, of the Persian Empire. That's the reference. That's what they're referred to. Now, they weren't just astronomers that looked at stars and went, ooh, big star. But they also, at the time, there was not this division where you had a scientist who determined what something was, and then you had somebody else who tried to give you, well, this is what it means. There wasn't a division there that said, oh, well, this is what, that's a star. Well, this is where there's meaning. Instead, studying them also led to discussing, well, do they have meanings? What do they have? What are the purposes here? What are the applications in life? As they looked at the world, the question was, how does this apply? What do we do with this now? Because knowledge was not intended to simply be this thing that you put on a shelf, but it's something that was supposed to drive you to action. Now, as we look at the Magi, there's something that we should realize. They survived multiple changes of empire. Now, it was very typical in that day and age for the transition of an empire, when one empire was conquered by another, or if you simply had internal strife, a little bit of civil war, and one king knocked out another one, that it worked about like, a business when a new CEO takes over and they go through and they just fire everybody that's in charge. Except they didn't fire them, they killed them. But the Magi were the wise men, the truth tellers, the soothsayers, whatever term you want to put with them, that had survived when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. Many of the Babylonian wise men were kept, and they became the foundation of the wise men. And then as the Parthians took over, the Magi, many of them were retained. They were not executed. Instead, they were considered above that, beyond that. Now, many of them were eunuchs, and so they weren't passing on power from one part of the family to the next. And if you want more information about that, call Abner when he gets back. That's his absolutely least favorite subject in the world. But it came up in his Sunday school class like 4 weeks running, so you can, he got really, really aggravated with it. But this is what's going on here. And so we, as Christian people, actually have a great deal of respect for someone who would have been counted in the annals of Persia and the Parthian Empire, would have been counted as one of the Magi. In fact, he's got a book of the Bible. His name is Daniel. Or, as the Babylonians called him, Belteshazzar. You see, when they put him in charge of all of the wise men of Babylon, and then when he's still, after the whole Daniel and the lion's den occurs in the Persian Empire, after the Persians have taken over, when he's put in charge of the wise men again, after the scheming ones are fed to the lions, he's in charge of the Magi, which means that his prophecies, and this is part of the Bible, most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. But there are certain parts of the Old Testament that are written in Aramaic, which was the overall language that was used across the Middle East at the time. And the biggest part of it that's in Aramaic is much of Daniel, because it's part of the record of what was going on in the Babylonian and Persian Empire that they recorded, that they kept. If you've ever wondered why the Magi are watching for the birth of the king of Israel, it's because 500 years before, Daniel, the prophet of the one true God, had actually given them a prophecy of the coming of the important king of Israel. And when you read Daniel, Daniel's great stories, 1 through 6, and then you hit 7, it starts getting prophetic, and everybody kind of goes, we're going to fade out now. We're talking about animals with 4 horns and stuff with this and that, and we've got archangels showing up, and we back out. But when you read through there, there's actually a prophecy in Daniel that establishes a number of weeks as a time, and it's not, we see the weeks as groups of 7 years, and it gives you from the time of Daniel to the time Jesus is born. It's a countdown. And it would have been recorded, because one thing the Persians were great at, they administered a massive empire, and they had a repressive dictator, and you would not have wanted to live in the Persian Empire. But this much is also true. They were incredible bureaucrats, and they wrote down everything and kept everything. I mean, archaeologists have found receipts for, leftover bricks. Yes, we had employed Brad to put in new bricks in this part of the palace, and then there were 47 bricks left over, and we let him take them home. Archaeologists have found scraps of that mess from the Persian Empire. Y'all, we don't have that from 3 years ago in our house, okay? But we found that it's 2,500 years old, and we've got that, that type of thing. So the Persians would have written it down. The Magi would have passed on the wisdom, and especially the wisdom of one like Daniel. Here's one who was thrown into the fiery, or he wasn't thrown into the fiery furnace, but his 3 friends were thrown into the fiery furnace. Here's one who was thrown into the lions. If you look at some of the other stories of Daniel, he demonstrated his wisdom over and over again and the power of his God. They would have paid attention to that. That's why the Magi are watching the stars and they're watching the calendar and they see what's going on. And so they take note of the star when it rises, because that matters to them. Now, what's going on in Israel? At the time, Israel is ruled by the Roman Empire. Remember, the Romans, the Parthians, don't get along. The Magi coming into the Roman territory would have been disruptive enough. But then they come and they talk to Herod the Great. Now, Herod was a pretty creative guy. Herod actually developed a method to make concrete that would set even if it was underwater. Now, some of y'all that build stuff, you think you do that every day. No big deal, right? There was a time before people had that figured out. Now, I don't know that Herod himself really figured it out, or if it was, Herod looked at 5 guys and said, you figure this out, I'm going to put you to death. But he gets credit for it historically. And that's why Herod, he's called the Great, not because he's an amazing ruler, but because the land of Israel is littered with stuff that Herod helped build, that Herod commanded the building of, because he had developed this ability. He had developed the right formula for concrete that would set. But he was, in all honesty, crazy and megalomaniacal. Herod had left orders, just to give you this peek into it, Herod left orders that on his death, the 10 leading men of every city in Judea, where he was the ruler, the 10 leading men in each city were to be executed, because that way there would be guaranteed weeping and mourning at his death. Now, folks, if you've got to leave orders for other people to be killed just so that everybody would be sad that you died, obviously, nobody likes you. That's just not a good thing. Now, fortunately, when Herod died, the people who took over said that this is a bad idea. Partly because the 10 leading men in each city were also among the 10 wealthiest men in each city, and when you kill taxpayers, you don't get as much out of them. And also recognizing that type of thing tends to spark rebellion rather than weeping. And so they didn't do that. But that was Herod the Great. That's who's in charge in Israel, and who's in charge in Judea, who rules from Jerusalem. Now, he is not a Jew. He is descended from the Edomites, so he's a distant relative. But there is no way in any shape, form, or fashion that Herod would have been considered the legitimate king of Israel. So now, let's take a look at the text, and we see there, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the time of King Herod, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is the one who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, or we saw his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When King Herod heard this, he was alarmed, and all Jerusalem with him. After assembling all the chief priests and experts in the law, we'll give Jacob a second to catch up. There we go. After assembling all the chief priests and experts in the law, he asked them where the Christ was to be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they said, for it is written this way by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are in no way least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. That's Micah 5:2, by the way. Then Herod privately summoned the wise men and determined from them when the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and look carefully for the child. When you find him, inform me, so that I can go and worship him as well. After listening to the king, they left, and once again the star they saw when it rose led them until it stopped above the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they shouted joyfully, or they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. One of my favorite ways to see that translated. As they came into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother, they bowed down and worshipped him. They opened their treasure boxes and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they went back by another route to their own country. Now, most of you know this story overall, what's going on. The wise men see his star. They see his star in the east. The other way to translate that is we saw a star and it's rising. Because east, the term for east and the term for rising go together. Would you like to guess why? Where's the sun come up? In the east. So east, okay, the sun's like bread. It rises with the east and sets in the west, rises in the east. So that's where that comes from. That's where that idea comes from. But that's, they see his star, they load up, they travel, they stop in Jerusalem, then they go on to Bethlehem, and they find Jesus, and they give him gold and frankincense and myrrh. So let's take apart a couple of things about this. First of all, the wise men had to have been paying attention. And we've established a little bit of why we think they were paying attention. But they had to have been paying attention to the world around them. This is not something that they simply stumbled upon. Folks, as we look at this, and as you look at your life, do not think that you're just going to simply, fortuitously stumble upon that which is good for you, that which is great, that which God has intended for your life. You're not just going to blunder across it in the streets someday. Now, somebody might be blessed with that. And what always happens when we talk about the idea of having a plan or having intention and developing and saying, I'm going to go out and seek that which God has for me. Well, I remember my cousin Fred. Now I don't want to pick on Fred, sorry. My cousin Bob, well, I prefer to pick on guys named Bob. He was sitting at home one day and it just fell out of the sky. He got a letter that told him exactly what to do with his life and everything worked out perfectly. Just because it happens to 1 in 10,000 people doesn't mean it's going to happen with you. It's the same situation that you have when people say, we start to try to talk about that, hey, as you date, as you look at somebody to marry, make sure it's somebody that brings you closer to Jesus than somebody that pulls you farther away. And then somebody pops up and says, well, I wouldn't have ever gotten saved if my girlfriend hadn't taken me to church. That's great. But for every one person that got saved because their girlfriend took them to church or their wife took them to church, there's 100 who instead destroyed the life of the person that they married. Just because there's an exception doesn't mean that the rule is not standard. You can drink the milk that's 2 weeks out of date, and every now and then it'll be all right. That doesn't mean that you should do it on a regular basis. Sniff it. Think about that. Y'all look for the truth and think in the things of life. Pay attention to that. The wise men were paying attention to the world around them, and they saw the star. And they took the time to at least seek out what the star might have meant. And they recognized that it meant something important had happened, that a king had been born in Jerusalem. This is why I think they had to have had Daniel to refer to. Because otherwise, who knows what they'd come up with. There's a lot of possibilities of direction to go to. You have to be paying attention. You have to start with what you've got that God has given you. Now, they get to Herod. Now, when they get there, they go to Herod because you show up, and if a king's been born, the king should know, right? It says they go to Herod. Where is the one who is the born king of the Jews? Now, I dare you to someday walk up to a person and look at them and say, hey, you're illegitimate. Where's the right guy? You wouldn't do that because you get punched in the nose. This is what they do to Herod. This is like dropping in at the White House and looking at the President of the United States and saying, hey, where's the guy who really won the election? It's wrong. The guy who's in the White House is the guy who won the election, right? That's not a fight you want to pick. But these guys have walked up to a king and said, wait, where's the person who's the rightful king? Look, if you get the chance to go to London and you get an audience with Queen Elizabeth, don't ask her where the right Queen of England is. That woman's had that job for a long time. She will not be amused. But this is what they do to Herod. Where is the rightful king of the Jews? And it says Herod has a sleepless night and all Jerusalem is troubled with him. And we know why. Because when we can look back and we see in history, we see what kind of person Herod was, and we see it pick up here in a few verses. We see them pick up with the fact that when the wise men don't go back and tell them where to find Jesus, he sends word to Bethlehem to have all the babies under the age of 2, all the boys under 2, executed. That's why all Jerusalem is troubled. They know this is a man who will be glad to leave a trail of bodies behind him. And those of you that are parents and grandparents or who just love kids, think about it. If it were your nephews, this is the tragedy that happens. This is the wickedness that Satan uses. We call that the slaughter of the innocents. And some people have tried to downplay it by saying, well, Bethlehem's not that big. It wouldn't have been that many. I don't care how few it was. How many does it have to be for it to matter? How many children have to be harmed before we care about something? If one should be too many. One should have been, was more than enough. But they travel down, and there you get big debates at Christmas time about, well, you put the wise men in the manger scene, and there should be, they're 2 years away. First of all, we don't know for sure that it was 2 years. We have no idea. Some of the church traditions that we have tell us it's about 12 days. That's actually the 12 days of Christmas, from Christmas to January 6th, which is Epiphany, and that's where that comes from. Other traditions we come up with, maybe it was 2 years, maybe it was a year and a half. Folks, if all you have to do with your life is quibble about whether the wise men should be right here or they should be on the other side of the room, you have a wonderful life. Please be very grateful for the blessings God has given you, and don't bother people that don't have time to stress about that. If that's what you have time to worry about, whether or not somebody put the wise men in the wrong place in Christmas decorations, which don't look anything like what really happened anyway, if that's what you have to worry about with your life, have a wonderful, everything's great for you. And so please, enjoy that and don't beat down on the folks who don't have time to worry about that. It is true that what we see in Matthew is a reference to a house. We see a reference to a child, which is a different word than the word for infant. Guess where the dividing line is between child and infant? Anywhere from 2 days to 3 years. So until you dig up an actual eyewitness who's worried about it, there's no certain way to know. And it doesn't much matter. Because if that's where you want to quibble, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is this. They find the child. They rejoice with exceeding great joy. They shout joyfully. They're exultant in what they have encountered. They find the one that they're seeking. They find who they've been looking for. They find who they've been waiting for since Daniel got pulled out of the lion's den, and the rest of the Magi are standing around going, wait a minute, there's a God that keeps hungry lions from eating people? And they looked back and said, this has got to be the same God that kept Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from being burned up in the fiery furnace. It's got to be the same God that has done this and done that, and maybe all these other stories, because Daniel's going to have the Torah, he's going to have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. He's going to have all those other books. You're going to say, maybe that Red Sea stuff's not just a legend. And they've been watching for 500 years for the next thing that this God is going to do. And they rejoice, exult. It's interesting that as the Magi come and they get to Jerusalem, and then it makes a turn. From the time they talk to Herod, it becomes that Herod sends the scribes to find out where, and then he calls them secretly, and then he goes and tells them to search diligently, but to search secretly, and then send word back to me so that I can go and worship. And it makes this turn from this big travel caravan, so you almost get the feeling of it went from a big party to a, y'all go quietly and go find this. But they can't help but shout joyfully at what God has done. So often I think we miss that part of this, that they suddenly shout joyfully that things are great. That there is the child. And they come and they open their gifts. They bring gold and frankincense and myrrh. And because there's 3 gifts, we developed that tradition that there are 3 wise men. And we could dwell on what the three gifts mean, and we've done that in times past and talked about it. Gold, and this is one of the great things about one of the Christmas songs that we sang Christmas Eve, Joy Has Dawned, that goes into it. The song We Three Kings also touches on it. The gold, that he's a king; frankincense, that he's the priest; myrrh, that he's the sacrifice. Actually wrote an entire book that's centered around that. What those gifts mean and how those how that should affect our approach at Christmas. They gave gifts and then worshipped, and then loaded up and beat feet back home. But they didn't bother to tell Herod that they were leaving, because they obeyed what God has told them to do. So, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because we're called to follow, to worship, to follow in obedience, but to follow with passion. Why does this matter? Because if we're not following, we won't see the other things. Sometimes we want to sit there, we want to sit there on the couch, we want to sit there in a pew, we want to sit there in a chair and wait to feel good about what God's called us to do before we start to move. And we want to sit there and we want to wait to see what God tells us to do and see what directions are next and make sure that we've got the whole plan before we set foot on the first step. But one thing that I have seen, and I've seen it reinforced and several folks I've been reading for devotional purposes, is this: God guides those who are moving in obedience. God guides those who are moving in obedience. Most of the time, the reason that we don't hear from God, first of all, is we take our Bibles and we say, oh, on second thought, I'm not going to read that today. And as a result, we go on back through our life without any sense of obedience in anything that we're doing. And then we wonder why it is that God gives us no guidance and why there is no joy. And it is because we have not yet begun to follow Him and take the first step so that the second step will be made clear. And yet we'll gather together and we'll sing, "Sweetly, Lord, have we heard Thee calling, come, follow me." And we see where thy footsteps falling lead us to Thee. Footprints of Jesus that make the pathway glow. And when you follow footprints on a path, it may have been a while since you've done this as a child, but whatever, if you're going to follow footprints, you're going to try to follow somebody through the woods to find them. You don't look 50 feet ahead and say, well, I think maybe there's one up there. Step by step by step. And we take that God guides us as we move in obedience. But the thing we have to do is make that first step. And this is how He guides the Magi. They knew enough from their study of what portions of Scripture that they had to set out and to follow. They knew enough to ask where the rightful king of Israel was, where the rightful born king of the Jews is. And they knew enough to follow the next piece that they got, again from Scripture, from Micah. By the way, if you don't think the Old Testament's useful, how are you going to find Jesus in Bethlehem without it? Daniel tells you when he's going to be there. Micah tells you that he's going to be there. Useful stuff that you find there in those prophets there in the back. They move in obedience. And then they worship fully. And through that, God brings joy. So what do we do about this? Because it's one thing to say, oh, God guides those who move in obedience, and then just leave it at that. What are the steps of obedience that we need to take? Well, the first step is this. You need to finish your year surrendered to Jesus. You may have started this year and gotten all the way to this point and be sitting there thinking, you know what, I've still not made certain in my life that I want to follow Christ. I don't know about this. You need to finish your year surrendered to Jesus. It may be that you need to surrender for salvation in the first place. And it may be that you've decided, even though you were saved years and years ago, you've decided to throw up a block and say, that's good, but I'm happy like I am, and I don't have to do anything else, because that's what the preacher told me all those years ago, was to repeat this prayer, and I wouldn't go to hell. And I'm really happy not going to hell, but I don't know about what I want to do on this earth. You need to finish the year surrendered to Jesus, that Not only do you not want to go to hell, but you want to glorify God in this life now. You wonder why there's no joy? Because you took your salvation and set it on the shelf and said, well, I'll save that for my funeral. That's not what it's for. Finish the year, surrender to Jesus. What is He calling you to do? You may need to ask questions about that and say, what is it to surrender to Christ? What is it to acknowledge that I'm a sinner in need of a Savior? It's a very simple idea, is to recognize that there are things in your life that have offended a holy God, and to realize that Jesus died in your place, rose up from the grave on the third day, that you could have salvation. Not from anything not by anything that you've done, but by the blood of Christ paying for your debt. Finish the year, surrender to Jesus. Next, detour from your normal plan to take time to worship Him. Notice when you look at the Magi, as they're coming into Bethlehem, and they see the star, and they see that the star is guiding them, they take time, they rejoice with exceeding great joy, and also when they get there, they give Him the gifts, and they take time to worship. They didn't just say, hey, we found it, let's drop these off, let's get on our way. Oh, hey, we found the baby. Hey, Fred, go back. Oh, picking on Fred again. Bob, go back and tell Herod where he is. They don't do any of those things. They stop and they worship. One of the things that I think is harmful to churches in general, and it's harmful to us as a church, is the belief that worship has to fit into our life instead of us recognizing that our lives fit around our worship of Almighty God. It's the belief that, okay, we cram that in to 10 o'clock to 11:15, maybe even 11:30 on Sunday mornings if the preacher gets long-winded. Guess what? The preacher will get long-winded. And we want to cram that into that one little slot and say, this is where it goes, and everything else flows on without it, and our normal life is just what it is. Detour from your normal plan to make time to worship God. It requires you to make choices. It requires you to make sacrifices to do that. Detour from your normal plan to take time to worship Him. If you never encounter that anything in your life you have to say no to because if you're going to choose to worship instead of do this, then you are not paying attention to the opportunities to worship and serve God that He's giving you. Because if there's not something you have to sacrifice, you're missing it. You're sacrificing worship for everything in your life. Dwell on that between now and when you make your resolutions. Detour from your normal plan to take time to worship Him. And one way to do that is to know the Word and His Word better through the year. Know Jesus and know the Word of God better through the year. Every year we try to come up with some Bible reading plan to encourage church to do, and we put it in the bulletin. And it's going to be in the bulletin this year, but we also have the full year if anybody wants to pick it up. But it's got five days, trying to make space for the fact that you need to read your Sunday school lesson so that you're better equipped for Sunday school. Right? Sunday school teachers, you want them to read their Sunday school lesson before they come? I need to see some of y'all nodding. Some of y'all just kind of looking blank at me, and your Sunday school teacher's like, yes. Read your Sunday school lesson. Take that book home. It's there for a reason. Read it, bring it back with you so that you're prepared. So that you know what you're going to talk about. So that when your Sunday school teacher says, anybody got any questions? You can say, yeah, I got a question. What about this verse? Those of y'all doing Bible studies for life, guess what? In the spring when it hits Romans, it's skipping Romans 9, but you need to read that and ask your Sunday school teacher lots of questions about Romans chapter 9. Okay? Ask your Sunday school teacher. Don't ask your pastor. But we've got, it's 260 readings. It's 260 readings that gives you a survey of the whole Bible. You will not read the whole Bible. You will read from the whole Bible if you follow this. Okay? But the copies of that are there, but it's also going to be in the bulletin. Know the Word of God. Know the Word, Jesus, who is the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. But also you need to know His Word better through the year. Make the time. Say, oh, I'm just too busy. Make the time. Because some of y'all, if I were to tell you what the upcoming big splashes on Netflix were going to be, you would be able to say, oh yeah, I've already watched all that. I binge watched this. Besides, I don't have time to read the Bible. I got to make sure I'll rewatch The Office 3 times this year. You've got the time. Make use of it. Because you will find the time to do those things which you count as valuable. And if you don't think that's true, realize this. There are people that actually watched the second half of the LSU beatdown of Oklahoma yesterday. That was an hour and a half of your life. It could have gone something different because there was no point in watching the other half of that game. It was over about midway through the second quarter. Don't tell me you don't have time. When you know all the gossip and all the everything. When you know all that's on the TV, when you know all that's happening here and there, when you can sit 2.5 hours for somebody to do your hair and set it perfectly, guys, you know who you are. I'm telling you, you don't have time. We have time to know the Word and to know His Word better through the year. Why? Because when we come to this, in Ecclesiastes, Solomon tells us this, having heard everything, I have reached this conclusion. Fear God and keep His commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. For God will evaluate every deed, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. It's Ecclesiastes 12, 3, 4. Or 13 and 14. I always call it 3 and 4. It's 13 and 14. It's the way Ecclesiastes wraps up. It's the one thing that Solomon finds that's not meaningless. Everything else is meaningless, empty, a vain chasing after the wind. But to fear God and keep His commandments, to worship God, and to keep His Word is the whole duty of what God has put us here for. That's what we're here for. So as we go into a new year, as we wrap up this year, let that be what drives us. That we'll finish the year surrendered to Jesus. That we'll take the time to worship Him. And we'll know the Word of God, Jesus, and know His Word better and better through the year. Let's pray together. Father, we thank You for this day. We thank You for Your love, Your grace, and Your mercy. We pray, Lord God, that You will move in our hearts. Help us to know You well. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we come to the time in our service that we call our time of invitation. It simply means this: we invite you to respond.